I'm going to, since our time is limited and I'm hoping we'll have a little bit of time for discussion at the end, I'm actually going to erase the annotations and go ahead and start the presentation. Let's see. What I can see here is that some of you, what I can see here maybe is that some of you are a little bit hesitant about peer feedback. And that hesitation about peer feedback, or maybe even my own fear about peer feedback, was what prompted me to look into this topic. So the subtitle of this presentation is How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Peer Feedback, because I actually used to hate peer feedback and I felt that my students hated it too. So I decided that I should take a look into the literature. And I think instinctively, a lot of us feel that there are values or feel there are benefits to peer feedback. Students are taking a more active role. They're taking more agency in their own learning. They're becoming part of a larger learning community. It's also a structure that helps to highlight and help students to become better at the skill of metacognition, where they realize what they know and also what they don't know, so they can help direct themselves on their own journey of learning. However, I think from some of our experiences, mine at least, and it sounds like some of yours too, and also in previous research, some questions have been raised about peer feedback. Some research has shown it's not always effective. A lot of students aren't comfortable with it or aren't convinced that it's actually useful. But the good news is that there is a lot of research that has shown that it is effective in improving student writing. One particularly interesting meta-analysis that was published last year, this is the Huisman article. Actually, they compared between students who revised papers based on self-assessment, peer feedback, and instructor feedback. And they found that peer feedback was far more effective than self-assessment, and it was almost as effective as instructor feedback. So using this can actually be really beneficial for our classes. And there are a number of other benefits as well. And you guys might notice that some of these other benefits the research has found really map well onto a lot of the goals the university has and the goals of our own departments. Like for us in ALA, we're really thinking about reflection, and for the university as a whole, this idea of building more independent learners. So the question then after all of this is, what can we do to make this peer feedback effective in our own classrooms? I'm going to start with some tips from the literature and then some of my own ideas that I've tried out in my classrooms. So first of all, it's really important to sell it to students so they're convinced of the value. And actually research has shown when they believe it's useful, they're going to benefit more from it. So I actually tell my students about the research. And one point that I always stress that really convinces them is that a lot of research has suggested that the true benefit of peer feedback is actually not for the student receiving the peer feedback, it's actually for the student giving the peer feedback, because when they go through that process of critically looking at a peer's paper, when they go back to revise and edit their own work, they're actually more effective at doing so. So once we've convinced our students, we also need to make sure we give them the tools to succeed. I think all of us as instructors know that giving effective feedback is really hard, and it's even harder for our students. So actually discussing the purpose, discussing the methods of peer feedback is really important. One of the ways I like to do this is to model peer feedback. I display, on the projector or on a screen share, a piece of writing. And then I talk through this, kind of using the think aloud model, explaining to the students how I'm thinking about this and modeling what type of feedback I want to give them. So this depends on your own assignments, the type of peer feedback you're doing with your classmates, but whatever type of peer feedback you're asking your students to do, you want to model that same thing. So some of the things I like to show them is the importance of balancing positive and constructive feedback, the importance of being specific. So just saying this paper is great isn't really helpful, but saying something like, oh, in paragraph 3, the evidence you used to support that point was really effective and convincing. And likewise, when there are areas to improve, modeling that as well, that you want to be specific. Don't just say like, oh, the paper's not convincing, but say, in paragraph 2, can you consider adding another source here to strengthen your point, something like that. And another thing you can do in the second stage, because the first stage, of course, is giving peer feedback. The second stage is for students to actually go back and try to implement some of those comments and revise their work. So you can also then later, maybe the next class period, model the revision process, because I think students sometimes struggle with that as well. And of course, you always want to stress that this is not judging a person as good or bad, that we're all working together on a process of improving our writing. And one of the things the research has shown is that the more you provide sort of specific guidelines or a specific structure for the peer feedback activity, the more effective it is. So how can we structure those activities? What I like to do, I like to start really simple. So you don't have to give peer feedback on a whole paper. You don't, and actually you probably shouldn't give peer feedback on a final draft. I like to give peer feedback at different stages of the writing process. So we'll start maybe with a peer feedback of an outline. And you can also start with using a format that's easy for students to use. So like even a checklist, yes or no. So an example of that, when I teach in ELI, we start by talking about how to write a paragraph. And then I ask students to give peer feedback. I simply give them a list of the elements that are important for an effective academic paragraph and just ask them to check their peer's paragraph, yes or no. Were they successful in including these different pieces? So another strategy here is you can have students give peer feedback in pairs. So what I mean here is a pair or a small group reading one paper together and discussing the feedback. So this can help students who are less proficient or less experienced hear from maybe more experienced students. And it can also give students confidence, those who are a little bit shy or unsure about their ability to comment on their peers' work. This can help them a lot. And research has shown that the quality of peer feedback improves when you do this. This is also great, by the way, for the student who doesn't turn in the assignment, because even if they haven't submitted, they can join another student and at least have the experience of giving peer feedback, even if they haven't submitted the assignment yet. Another thing is you can focus what you ask students to give feedback on. So they don't need to comment on every aspect of a text. This saves you time, and you can target maybe a specific rubric criterion or something you know is a common challenge. So you might ask students to look at a paper and just comment on or focus on something like integration of sources, depending on the criteria and the rubric that you're using. Another format here that I sometimes use is what I like to call the treasure hunt. So I ask students to read a piece of peer writing and look for a specific element. So maybe we're talking about evidence to support claims. I just ask them, read through the paper, put a star next to places where you think the claim has been really strongly supported, and maybe put a question next to places where you feel like it might need stronger evidence. So you can do this really quickly. It doesn't have to take a whole class period. You can do this like 10 minutes right at the beginning or the end of a class. Once students get a bit more comfortable with peer feedback, there are other ways we can experiment with it. One structure I like is where I let students take the lead. They share or project a piece of writing, and they read that paragraph or piece of writing out loud and elicit feedback from the class. What's nice about this is, number one, only students who are comfortable and who want peer feedback would volunteer to do this. Obviously, you might say, well, we don't have time to do this for all students. And that's right. You'd only do this for maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 students. You can do it as a whole class or in small groups. The point is the students volunteer to share their work. And I think it's not a problem that not everyone gets peer feedback, because the point here is everyone's getting a chance to give feedback. And when the instructor kind of sits in that audience and nods your head or provides reassurance, that helps give students confidence about the peer feedback that they're giving and that they're receiving for the writer. Another idea, and this is an idea from my colleague Mariah Fairley, and I just started doing this semester, is making peer feedback more reflective. So her idea that I implemented was that students work in pairs to discuss a piece of writing. So the writer tells the partner about his or her writing process and shares questions or concerns they still have. The pair reads the work together and addresses those questions. Then the writer takes notes on key points of the peer feedback and sets his or her own goals for revision. And the second step here is then that the student revises. So when the student submits the revised draft, they include the original text. They write a short paragraph reflecting on the feedback they got from their reviewer and setting their own goals for revision. Then they include the revised text and another short paragraph reflecting on how well he or she was able to actually implement those revisions or achieve the goals that he or she set for himself. So you're giving the student a lot more ownership here. The final point I wanted to make is, in terms of technology, There are a lot of ways we can do peer feedback online. So Turnitin has peer mark, Blackboard has self and peer assessments. There's a dedicated peer feedback platform called peergrade.io. I find it's actually much easier to use than Blackboard or Turnitin, but for me personally, I don't want to ask students to use too many different platforms, especially online. So I actually just use Google Docs, a Google Doc in a Google Drive folder. And I think I'm going to end here so we have time to open a little bit of a conversation before we finish. But if anyone's curious about how I do that, I can show that to you guys. So thank you guys so much. And does anyone have any questions or comments? No questions?
I have a comment, Alyssa. I loved all what you said, and I'm 100% convinced of everything you said. The only thing that I use is that we put in workshops, we put, a paragraph on screen, and then as a class, we give feedback to the person. And I found this very effective. But the problem is, what if the proficiency level, language proficiency level is really, really acceptable? And what I noticed this semester, and I don't want to be mean, but their ability to critically think is not there. Then how would I make peer review succeed?
Yeah, I agree. This is a concern. And usually I ask them to look at higher order concerns. I don't ask them, like, peer feedback is not proofreading, it's not finding a comma out of place. But even when you're looking at the ideas, the organization, I know it can be hard for students. For groups that are really weak, I like trying the group peer feedback where they can kind of support each other. This is one strategy I could suggest for that. But I think the thing to remember is, even if they're not able to give the highest quality feedback, the fact that they're going through the process of the peer feedback is still beneficial for all of the students. Yeah, Jasmine, you have your hand up.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Alyssa. This was a great and nice sort of like summary of all the possible ways to do it. At the beginning, I thought when you asked if we do peer.
Oh, Jasmine, you're muted. Oh no, I think we lost. Did we lose you, Jasmine?
Hi. Hello? Can you guys hear me or no?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. I lost connection. Building on what Shireen said, I use peer feedback a lot and I'm very convinced, but what's been happening recently, and I don't know how to respond to the students, is I'll have a few of those weak students that Shireen was talking about, just because Turnitin doesn't let us pair them up anymore. So I have to do it randomly. And they'll be paired up with the very strong students. And so the strong students will email me and say, I didn't get anything useful from the peer. And then I sort of don't know what to tell them. And they invariably ask me to do it for them then.
You know what,
so I was wondering if you had any strategies for that.
What I do for this, actually, I tell them, you take those peer review questions and answer it for yourself. I don't know if that, and personally, I found Turnitin really hard to work with. So I don't use Turnitin. I find it really inflexible. But I give them, if they're questions, I give them in a Google Doc and I tell them, you go through that Google Doc and answer them on your own paper. I don't know.
Okay, that's a really nice suggestion. Alyssa.
Did you use Blackboard?